All right, now the big one for this week is going to be object constructor notation. So what we've been dealing with up to now, what we see here, is object literal notation. Object literal notation. What we're going to start dealing with is object constructor notation. Object constructor notation. So let me just get us started here. I'm going to write a function. I'm going to call it person with a capital P. And what this function is going to contain is going to say this dot first name equals Kingsley, and this dot last name equals Papa Giorgio. That's it. Simple as that. Okay. Now, we've discussed this a little bit. We know that this, when it's contained in an object, refers to that containing object. So here, this dot first name refers to Evan, and this dot last name refers to Winston. That makes sense. This inside an object refers to the containing object itself. What is this referring to here? Well, first let's try some things out. I'm going to call person. That's my object. I'm going to try to execute this person function and take a moment and think about what should return. If you guessed nothing or undefined, you're absolutely correct. This function is not returning anything. It's not even doing anything. It's not console logging anything. It's not running an alert. Nothing. So it simply returns undefined. Therefore, what's the use? Well, let's dig a little deeper. I'm going to go inside the function, and I'm going to console.log this. And I'm going to run the person function again. This, inside this function, refers to our window, which is what this refers to. What just happened there? Sorry, I think I was leaning on my space bar. This, inside this function, refers to the window object, which is the same thing which this refers to in the global execution context. When it's just out here, not in a function, not in a specific code block, when it's just floating around out here, that's the window. Okay, so there's nothing special about this in this function, at least not yet. Okay, so what is the purpose of this function? Well, this is a constructor function, and constructor functions are usually indicated by a capitalized first letter. Okay, that should have appeared a little weird to you because by now you're used to the fact that we do not capitalize the first letter of really anything in JavaScript unless it's in a string. Okay, it's very rare that we'll capitalize a first letter like this. When you see this in a function name, it indicates a constructor function. A constructor function. Now, on its own, this function is not doing much of anything, and it is returning nothing. So what is its purpose? Well, let me go ahead and create a variable called Kingsley. And I'm going to set this variable equal to person, the function, but before that function, because currently Kingsley should be undefined. In fact, let's prove that. I'm going to call Kingsley, and we get undefined. Okay, nothing surprising. But prior to person, I'm going to add a JavaScript recognized keyword. And that keyword is new. Notice how it just changed the color coordination of everything on this line. Okay, that new is a, what's the word? A reserved, I've forgotten the word. A reserved keyword which JavaScript recognizes. Okay, new. And new is a keyword used in conjunction with constructor functions to do something very specific. What's happening is new is telling the browser that this is a constructor function, and together the two of these create an object on the fly. Okay, so new indicates to this function that it needs to create an object. New indicates to this function that it should create an object. Create and return an object. So let's run this code and see what Kingsley contains. So Kingsley contains an object, as we see. And if you notice, that object even has a particular type name here, which is person with a capital P. We don't usually see that with objects. I mean, if I call person with lowercase p to try and get this object here, we don't see that. We don't see any type name here. But if I call something like document.body, well, then we see something a little similar, HTML body element type name. Okay, there's something similar going on there. But what happened here is new plus the person constructor function created an object on the fly. That tells the browser that this function needs to create an object. And if this function is creating and returning an object, then what do you think this is going to refer to? Well, this inside this function is going to refer to the object that it's creating. The object of type person. Okay? So what's happening? Let's take it step by step. As soon as this function starts to execute, there is thereafter an empty object. An empty object. Nothing special. It runs through the code. I'm going to comment out the console log. And it sees this, which is our object, dot first name equals Kingsley. Well, what does this do to our object? To put it another way, it's called person. It's got first name, last name, and get full name. So what happens if I write person dot job equals mentor? What happens if I do that? Well, what happens is person now has a brand new property called job with a value of mentor. So the function runs, we create an empty object, and then we see object.firstname equals Kingsley. So what does that do? That creates a first name property equal to Kingsley. Then it sees this, our object, dot last name equals Papa Giorgio. So what does that do? It creates a last name property with a value of Papa Giorgio. And just like that, we have a brand new person object which is contained in our Kingsley variable. We've created an object on the fly using a constructor function, or object constructor notation. Now the next obvious question is, why would you ever do this? Why would you ever do this? Well, to answer that question, let's take out these hard-coded strings here, Kingsley and Papa Giorgio. And instead, let's feed in two arguments to person. I'll call them first and last. So these are parameters, function parameters, first and last. And we're going to define this brand new object's first name property equal to the value of the first parameter, and the last name property equal to the value of the last parameter. So now whenever I run this person function, it's going to expect two arguments. So if I wanted to create a Kingsley variable that contains an object with first name Kingsley, last name Papa Giorgio, I'm going to run new person with the arguments of Kingsley, comma, Papa Giorgio. Reload. And Kingsley contains the correct name. So far, so good. Now how about I create a Matt variable equal to new person, and their names are going to be Matt and Winston. Is not Matt Brody. My brother's name is actually named, my brother's name is actually Matt as well. Okay, so I've created a new person object with the first name Matt and the last name Winston. Let's see. There you go. Okay, now let's do a Matt Brody one. There's Matt Brody. Okay, so that is how constructor functions work. And why this is easy, or why this is useful, is we can create as many objects and as complicated an object as we'd like on the fly without having to code them all out in object literal. How about this get full name property? Can we work that in to our constructor function to make that just completely automated? Yeah, I think we can. I'm going to have this dot get full name equal to function return this dot first name plus space plus this dot last name. Let's check on Kingsley. Okay, so Kingsley dot first name works. Kingsley dot last name also works. Kingsley dot get full name. We get a function, so we need to invoke it. Okay. So there we go. We've actually added a method that gets automatically inserted into each object. Now, what if you didn't want to have to invoke get full name? What if you didn't want get full name to be get full name? You just wanted it to be full name. You didn't want to have to invoke it every time you wanted to access this data. Well, what we could do is take this function and immediately invoke it. So as soon as this dot first name and this dot last name have value, as soon as a person is created, the function is immediately invoked. It returns what it needs to return, and that value gets stored in the full name property. To invoke a function immediately, all you need to do is wrap it in quotes, wrap it in parentheses, and follow it with parentheses. So now let's take a look at Kingsley. Oh, we got undefined, undefined. So that didn't quite work. The reason why that didn't quite work is we actually need to give it arguments when we immediately invoke it. There we go. So I went a little off the reservation with that one. We're going to discuss immediately invoked functions, also known as IIFEs. In fact, let me write that down here. Immediately invoked function expression, IIFEs. We're going to go over those a little more carefully in a later video. But for now, I'll walk you through it one more time. We wanted this function, which returns the full name, to invoke immediately so that it stored the value which it returns in this full name property without us having to invoke it whenever we wanted to see it. Okay, and this is a pretty common practice in JavaScript. We're going to be using IIFEs more and more as time goes on, but this is just a pretty small introduction. And in order to get it to work properly, we needed to pass into the function this.firstname and this.lastname when it is immediately invoked. Now, the way the browser reads this is kind of like this. Let me go ahead and copy this. I'll paste it up here and call it concatenate. So now it's a named function. It's kind of the same thing as writing this. So now this dot full name is this function invoked with these two arguments. The difference between this and having just this in the value of your property is this does not automatically invoke, or as it was written before, this is as it was written before. This is not a function which is being automatically invoked. This is a function which is being immediately invoked using these two arguments. This is a named function, just like when we run person with these two arguments. However, this is not an immediately invoked function expression. For it to be an immediately invoked function expression, we would need to write the function, keep it anonymous, and invoke it right away. Okay? So I'm going to bring it back to that IIFE format. No pun intended. And let's go ahead and bring it all together on one line, make it a little more straightforward. Okay? So the function xy, return x plus space plus y, is immediately invoked with the arguments of this.firstname and this.lastname. If this is confusing, don't worry about it too much. This is a pretty simple pattern that you can use. But we're going to address IIFEs much more in depth in due time. For now, we've created a person factory function, a person constructor function, which creates person objects with these arguments. And it automatically populates 3 properties based on the arguments which are plugged in. So let's create a few more people. Create an Evan. And we'll do a Lisa. And a Brian. There's Evan. There's Lisa. There's Brian. And finally, there's Kingsley. Okay, so those are our constructor functions. They are smoother, easier than writing objects in object literal. And if you have quite a few methods, especially immediately invoking functions like this, then with limited code, you can create quite a bit more. Okay? And we can, of course, create these on the fly. They don't all need to be stored in variables. We could, for example, create an array of people, each with a new person inside them. Now, if I call people, it has two person objects, Evan and Matt. Okay, so those are constructor functions, constructor notation, and we're going to apply this a little more actionably in the next video.